It's a pleasure to stand before you on this brilliant October day out there and in our new venue here at the Atlantic Resort. And it's always nice to stand in front of this group for me. For the new members and those whom I haven't met, I'm Mike Slane. I am the past president. I emphasize the past. I'm standing in for Deanna, our president Deanna, who's on a swimming trekking tour of Vietnam. And I warned her about the South China Seas and sea snakes and sharks and that sort of thing, but it's not for the faint of heart, but she's tough. And there she is. This event is brought to you by a very dedicated group of people, our board of directors, many of whom are in the audience here tonight. And this particular event, through the generosity of Peg Murray as the sponsor, in memory of her husband, Vince Murray. So thank you very much, Peg. Thank you. My friend, Margaret. Before I introduce our speaker, Ray McKenna, I just want to brief you on a couple of our upcoming events. We're in the final throes, the last 2 weeks of the Interpretive Center on Thames Street. So for those of you who may be new and haven't gotten down there, I encourage you to take a visit. It's open Thursday through Sunday, this weekend, next, noon to 5 p.m. and will close on the 30th of October. But I also want to emphasize that after we close, if any of you in here have family or friends visiting over the fall or winter, spring, and you would like to get them into the museum, our telephone numbers are on the door. You can look me up, and we have several people, including Steve Marino and myself, that are willing to come down on pretty short notice and open the museum for relatives and friends of members. So keep that in mind. We're on the final day of the Barney Street Cemetery tours. That will take place on the 30th of October. 1 p.m. and that's a real treat. Again, Steve, our very own Steve Marino, 1 p.m. Is that right, Steve? Good. 1 p.m. He's very informative, a lot of detail and a lot of humor involved in that particular tour. In November, we'll have our last lecture. What's the date in November? 14th of November. Dr. Kurt Schlichting will join us for the final brief of 2017. And just by coincidence, interesting, his last brief in spring of 2018 followed our speaker tonight, Ray McKenna. The two of them were back to back 5 years ago now. And another nice segue is that Kurt Schlichting talked about chain migration, and many people in the room said they would like to hear more about chain migration, specifically mentioned several times, and tonight, voila, here we are. Let me say a couple words about Ray McKenna. Ray earned, he's a lifelong history, can I say nut? Is that okay? Lifelong history nut. He earned degrees, undergraduate degrees from the University of Rhode Island, graduate degrees in history from the University of Connecticut. He was a history teacher for many years before entering the fine wine trade. I love that combination. That's great. But he never retired from researching the Irish immigration. And he's active right now in retrieving Irish immigration records from the Old Stone Bank project. He has 4,000 of them so far. And he's tied it to a couple people in the room already tonight. And I'd like you to, he'll tell us more about that. Please give a warm Newport welcome to Raymond McKenna. Ray, step up.
Thank you. I can't sit still, so I'm going to take this thing out, try not to blow your eardrums out. You can hear me? Let's get on to something. Where are my pictures? There we are. Thank you so much. I'm just overwhelmed with how many people have turned out tonight. I'm also aware from little conversations I had prior to starting that some of you remember specifics from my last talk. Okay, I get the picture. So some of you remember some of the stories from my last talk, which might show up in this one, but there's a lot of new material because that was 5 years ago and there's some tremendous material. What I'm going to talk to you tonight about are two places. One of them, a little patch of land in the south of Ulster, and the other Providence, Rhode Island. Of course, when I talk about Providence, Rhode Island, people didn't just live there, but the concentration was in the city. But they also lived in all the towns and villages and out into Warren and Bristol and not so much down into Newport. We can talk about that later. Where am I? That's what I want. Oh, that's right, it goes back and forth. Sorry, Ann. So anyway, the images I'm going to use tonight come from within, they come from that little patch of land, or they come from Providence, with the exception of, I think one of the boys that you're going to see who worked in a factory actually lived in Anthony, Rhode Island. That's how I tried to keep it right in the city as much as I could. I didn't just take random pictures from other places. What I'm going to tell you about Emyvale and about the counties of Monaghan and Tyrone are very specific to those places. They're also general and they apply to other places as well. So in this first picture, my friend McKenna, and I also have to tell you that you'll see it in the next slide, the little patch of land is today known as McKenna country. It was known as McKenna country 200 years ago. They were saying it then, they're saying it now, but half of the people who live there are either McKennas or they're married to McKennas. I have at least 2 McKenna lines that I've identified. I probably have 10 if you get right down to it, because we're a clan. The name shows up first in the 1200s in written records. The mythology goes back to the 8th century. So McKenna's have been there for a long time and it's hard to sort it all out. The photograph on the right, that woman, it's a picture by Rose Shaw. Rose Shaw was a young woman who went as a domestic servant to live in a family, a wealthy family in this area over the border in County Tyrone. She lived maybe 8 or 9 miles from where my family grew up. But her pictures obviously are not from the 1840s or 1850s. They're from the turn of the century, a little bit after the turn of the century. You'll see in the pictures that in certain ways, while Ireland changed drastically, in other ways things stayed the same. This young woman, for example, who's out gathering peat in order to heat her house, that's what that basket is for, and you'll see that she's barefoot. It remained a very poor place for a very long time. This is what I'm talking about. You can see in the map on the upper right-hand side, you see the northern part of Ireland. And what I'm talking about is that green area up at the top and over the border, the north of County Monaghan and the south of County Tyrone. The only thing that separates the two places is a little river called the Blackwater. And so for hundreds of years, people have intermarried across borders. They have relatives across borders. The only thing that separates them traditionally was that they were in 2 counties, and today what separates them is that County Monaghan is part of the Republic and Tyrone is part of of Northern Ireland. When the English realized they were going to lose Ireland, they took a look at the 2 counties and all the counties of Ulster, and they let 3 counties go, which had majority Catholic populations. They felt it was safe to do that. It was going to be better than having war. And so consequently, my friends, my cousins live right on the border. So it's a poor land. Luckily, there was a study in 1801, and then there was even a better study, very detailed study that the British government did in 1824. And later on in 1837, there was another study. The 1824 study describes houses, describes clothing. Most people made their own clothes, described poverty in great detail. They described the minerals that came out of the land. They described everything they could. What they were doing is, it was the Ordnance Survey, and they needed to have all that information so they could make sure they taxed the Irish enough. Somewhere along the line, they lost interest in it. So if you come from County Cork, you won't find the Ordnance Survey doing much with the County Cork. The first few years, detail, 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 and later on, no detail at all. So the English did us one little favor in that they gave us a good history of this place. It is hardly at a crossroads. It is in between Derry and Dublin, but doesn't have to be. There are other ways to get there. It's a place of, they call it the land of the little hills. It is not dramatic looking. It's nice farmland, but it's not fancy. And here are people still gathering in the linen. You can see the children playing down below. The houses were described as being made of stone at the best and made out of wattle and daub at the worst. And once they were built, they were not maintained. And they weren't maintained because people didn't own the houses. If they improved the houses, their rents would go up. And so all the incentive to take care of things wasn't there. Now, this next slide is interesting. This is where I think that this part of northern Monaghan and South Tyrone separate from other parts of Ireland, other than parts of Dublin. About 30 miles away, 25 miles away as the crow flies, is the town of Lurgan in County Armagh. And Lurgan is close to Belfast. And Lurgan and Belfast were the centers of textile production in Northern Ireland. There was also a bit of textile production in Dublin as well, but most of it was up in the north. And so households were supplied with looms. They were supplied with spinning wheels. And so they were supplying material to the factories that would do the work in Lurgan or in Belfast. And that all worked very well until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. During the Napoleonic Wars, there was a lack of trade, to put it bluntly, between the continent and the British Isles. The British needed clothing, they needed blankets, they needed that kind of material for their sailors and for their soldiers. They were at war with Napoleon. When that ended, the home textile industry pretty much fell apart. And the people that lived in the northern Monaghan could not pay the rent for the land that they farmed without the money from the textiles. So once that happened in 1815, you begin to see, actually you're going to see it, it starts happening even earlier. People begin to leave this area because they're starving. So this is a really interesting painting from 1771 that was painted near where my family lived in North Monaghan. The record on the upper right-hand side is the record of the 6 acres that my great-great-great-grandfather, James Dugan, farmed in Durnalosset, a townland. He also had 3 acres in another townland. Sounds like 9 acres is a lot of, should have made him wealthy. But in fact, 9 acres is what you pretty much needed if you're going to be able to have a family and supply a family, because the farming was very inefficient. They didn't have the machinery they needed. They didn't have horses. It was illegal to own a horse unless it was, I think, like a old horse or something. You couldn't, there was so many things that they couldn't do. So they didn't have horses, they didn't have oxen. So 9 acres pretty much took care of his family. And the record down the bottom on the right-hand side is a record of the baptism of one of their children. Now, another thing that was happening, and it was happening all over Ireland, but it was particularly bad up on the border between the north and the south, up in South Ulster. 15 miles from where my family grew up, in 1795, 2 years after the birth of James Dugan, my ancestor, the Orange Order was created, 15 miles away. And even before that time, people would have their parades for William II, and they would go into villages and go into land where Catholics were and beat them up. I've found many examples of that. Too many examples of it. It's just and the Irish and the Catholics would fight also do their little bit too. But it was an instigation from the Orange Order. At the same time, the United Irishmen, which had been formed in Belfast among Irishmen who were both, who were Catholic, they were Church of Ireland, which was Episcopalian, and they were also Presbyterian. And they got together and they said, we have to get our independence from England, and we're going to fight together as Irishmen, not as Catholics and not as Protestants. And in 1795, it was estimated that almost all the men in County Monaghan were belonged to the United Irishmen. And we know that it was only 3 years later that there was an attempt to oust the English from Ireland, which failed terribly, the rebellion of 1798. But before that happened, an event happened that should be more famous in Ireland, and for different reasons, it didn't get the publicity after it happened. The militias, the British government created militias in all the counties, but they didn't trust the Irishmen to serve in their own county. So the Monaghan militia was sent to Belfast, and someone leaked the word that there were a lot of people among that group who were United Irishmen. And a bunch of them came forward and said, nope, it's not us. 7 men were arrested, and they said, if you will just renounce the United Irishmen, then you can go free. 4 men did not. The 2 McKenna brothers came from about 2 miles just north of my family, so my family probably knew them. The other 2 fellows came from just south of where my family lived. I mean, all in the same neighborhood, basically. Kind of like not even as far as going into Newport from here. Anyway, one of the fathers was there, McKenna, who was hard pressed to come, but he came and he said that if he had sons that would betray Ireland, then they're worth nothing. It was a sad thing, but it was a very strong statement. Now, the rebellion was put down. Theobald Wolfetown, one of my heroes, led a French army. It was a disastrous result. And after all the bloodshed that went on as a result, things kind of quieted down in Ireland, but people weren't happy. 1821, there was another famine. They'd had famines from time to time. None of them was as big as the one from 1845 to 52, but it was tough. People were trying to get out as much as they could. These are all photographs of people taken within a few miles of where my family lived, and right in the heart of this little patch of land I'm talking about. The fellow in the center's name is Cormac Holland. I understand there's a person named Holland here tonight. Cormac Holland had relatives in Providence, and the little boy in the lower left-hand side also, I think his name was McGovern, he also had relatives in Providence. I know that because I've been in contact with the descendants, and I suspect that most of the people in the photographs here had relatives living in Providence or in the villages outside of Providence. So things were tough, things were bad, and then in 1845, of course, the famine hit. And about 4 or 5 months ago, I came across a document that really blew my mind. It was a document that was in plain sight that I don't think any of the local historians in Ireland ever came across. It was in the newspaper. It was in the Northern Standard. And the spring, in May of or late April of 1846, the sheriff of Monaghan, who was assigned to that post by the British government, he called together a meeting of all the landlords in North Monaghan and South Tyrone. And a reporter from the Northern Standard asked to be present. And there was a big talk, we don't want anybody, it's a very difficult situation going on here. People are suffering, we don't want anybody. Well, he talked his way into being there. And I found the whole transcript of the conversation they had. First off, it was held in this big, imposing house, the county courthouse of Monaghan. You can see above the, up in the frieze, there's the symbol of British power. And a group of men got together and they discussed what to do. One of the things that surprised me was that a guy named Enketel got up and said, you know, these people, they can get food. Their farmers are bringing potatoes to the market every week. And then at the end of the day, they bring the potatoes home because they're not sold. The people can buy these. What they ignored was the fact that the people didn't have any means to buy them. So the food was there. And so they had a discussion. And as you can see in that last quotation, which I should have memorized, the sheriff said, well, basically, let's just wait until a time when things are really serious, and then we can have a meeting and we'll form a committee. It's right there. This is a guy. How many people have heard somebody say we'll form a committee? Yeah. Hey, before I go further, I want to ask a question. How many people here have ancestry in Providence? Irish ancestry? Cool. You're my sister. I know you do. How many, does anybody know, how many people have ancestry on Federal Hill in Providence? And more of you may not know. Federal Hill, that's why I call it Federal Hill Irish, was an Irish neighborhood. At any rate, I just lost. So 4 days before they have their meeting, a ship arrives in New York. Now they're saying it's not a crisis yet, but why did 88 people from County Tyrone and County Monaghan get on the ship and spend 49 days at sea to come to New York? They came because the crisis was already on them. And that's what was so outrageous when I read that these people said, well, there's not a problem. Maybe we could, have them work more and we'll pay them for more work. People are starving, they're thin, they're suffering. So these guys, 88 of them, there were, I think, 150 or so people on the ship. 88 said, we're going to Providence. And they were going to Providence. You see a bunch of McKennas on there. Hey, it's not me. I thought for a while that Barney McKenna was my another ancestor, but I found out he's not. They went to Providence. He immediately got a job at Allen's Print Works. Some of you know about Allen's Print Works. Philip Allen, who at one point was the governor of the state, employed somewhere around 200 to 250 Irishmen at a time. So he got a job there. His boys got jobs there. They were able to get housing right near the old North burial ground. And I think it was housing that they paid for from Allen. Incidentally, Mary, you can see it on there, Mary had a baby while she was coming over. I think they had 6 or 7 kids with them, and then little Barney was born. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the weeks and weeks in the hold with crying babies, dying people? Actually, they didn't have anybody die. They were very lucky on this ship. So the question is, why Providence? Why do they come to Providence? Is it just happenstance? No. With the case of Barney McKenna, I have no doubt in my mind, I haven't been able to prove it. I've proved it with other people. I haven't proved it with him, that he and Mary had relatives that they were able to secure jobs before they came. If you came to the town and you didn't have a job, you weren't going to stay long. So they came with jobs. And Providence in the early 19th century, as I think most of you know, was transitioning from purely trade with a little bit of agriculture, or some agriculture, but a lot of trade, international trade, including the slave trade, which was outlawed in 1808, which meant that a big source of money for Providence, just like for Bristol and for Newport, a little less for Providence, but they were going to lose out on that. At the same time, at the end of the 18th century, this fellow Samuel Slater, who is a very, very famous man, an Englishman, was recruited by Moses Brown to come up to Pawtucket and open a textile factory. He had memorized, I think you all know the story, he had memorized how to make the machine when he was in England. He came over and he put it together. The thing was that his factory could make yarn, it could make thread, but it couldn't weave. And so he needed weavers. So maybe the first person, I don't think he is. And my friend, Father Bob, will say, I don't think he's the first one of the chain, but he could be the first one of the chain. He shows up and he's recruited by Slater in 1792 to come over and be a weaver. He comes from Lurgan, 25 miles from my family's house. Okay, so he's coming over. He needs weavers. He opens up a whole shop. He needs more weavers. I'm quite sure, I haven't found it yet, but I'm quite sure that he pulled in weavers that he knew from Lurgan in Northern Ireland. And certainly by right after the Napoleonic Wars, by 1818, I see very clear evidence of people coming from County Tyrone, coming from County Armagh right nearby. And in the 1820s, more and more of them are coming. That is probably the beginning of the chain, although it could have started with Thomas Robinson back in 1792. So if you take a look, we've got Providence in 1835, we've got Providence in like you can see it, I can't. And then again in 1858. And if you look at the numbers, the population of Providence skyrocketed. Now, all these Yankees didn't start making whoopee and having lots and lots of extra kids. I think we know from history that when you become middle class, you tend to stop having so many kids. You establish a certain lifestyle, and you just, I mean, it was going on in America when the Irish showed up. The families were getting smaller and smaller. Not the rural families so much, but the city families in America were getting smaller. This population is because of immigration. I often see people, or I read that 80% of the immigrants who came in were Irish, and the other 20% were from Scotland, England, other places. I can't prove it, but I would say 80 is a low number. But certainly it's a lot of Irish people pouring in, and then they're still having big families, and the population of the city is taking off. I think by 1860 or so, and Father Bob could tell me if I'm right or wrong on this thing, I think maybe 40% of the population of the city was Irish or Irish American. Scared the living bejesus out of the Yankees, I gotta say. And I can understand, I think we can all understand why they were frightened, because this is a big change. We see today when people want to bring in a few thousand people from Syria, how Americans often go crazy, or a few people from Ukraine, they go crazy. This was population that was showing up every day coming into the city. So how did the city handle it? What they did, they used an old law that it was an English law. I'm going to get in trouble because I keep mentioning England, and my wife is English. A British law that goes way back into Middle Ages, a warning out that when people arrived in Providence, they had to appear before the, what the heck was he called? The man who was going to tell them whether they could stay or they had to leave. And they had to prove that they had a job, that they had family, that they were going to be able to take care of themselves. And if not, they were sent away. These are the slips that were written out for people to be sent away. You can find these in the way up in the top of City Hall in Providence in the archives. When this all was opened up, these had been sealed for like 150 years. So you have right there, you've got Bridget Conroy. They give her $3 in February of 1837, I think it is. in order to take care of her family needs because she's suffering. A month later, they pay for a funeral for one of her babies. They did a lot of good. You know, they threw people out. They threw, I say, three kinds of people. They threw out Irish people, Black people, and prostitutes. And the prostitutes they threw out for the most part were either Black or Irish. And there are hundreds of these records that you can find at City Hall. But they also could take care of people. Oh, this is the one. This is the one that has Bridget Conroy getting money. They gave money, and they tons of records giving money for firewood, for heating, giving money for food, helping them with medical issues. So they really tried to do what they could, but they were overwhelmed. And of course, the people of the city said, we can't help these people. And we all know that 1854 is the year of know-nothings. And that's when not only Providence, but all of Rhode Island and all of New England and good part of the Eastern United States turned against the Irish people because they didn't want to spend money on them and they didn't want them around. Anyway, but there were other good things going on. In 1838, they consecrated the first of the two cathedrals, the first cathedral, St. Peter's and Paul. And it was located very close to where the current cathedral is. And in 1852, on July 4th, Catherine Dugan, who is the daughter of James Dugan and Ellen McKenna, married Peter McKenna, and they married at the cathedral, my great-great-grandparents. And because the 4th of July fell on a Sunday, it was a 2-day holiday. The city went crazy. The record of what went on in the city is amazing. They had bandstands in different places out by the cove, and they had music on the ships. They had regattas going on. They hired people, and I've got a list of the names. I even got the little tags that mostly Irishmen, to ring bells in every church. Didn't matter the church. They ring bells all day long. So on July 4th, all day long, on July 5th, bam, bell, 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 bell. I think those guys went deaf. So it was a big to-do, and I like to think that my family that was living up on Federal Hill had a big do going on with good Irish music. And since they spoke both Irish and they spoke Gaelic, they spoke English, it was probably quite a nice party that I didn't get invited to, and I would have invited you if I had been invited myself. So this is Federal Hill. This is my ancestral home. I took my wife Gail up there for lunch the other day. My family lived for 4 generations on the corner of Di Pasquale Square. So it was called Taft Street at that time. The square wasn't there. It was a street that went through. And on the corner of Spruce and Taft Street, they had a 2-story house. They shared it with, well, Peter, by 1865, Peter and Catherine had 4 kids, so there were 6 of them. The Dugans lived there too, the in-laws, so with 2 of their grown children, so that was another 4 people, that was 10. There was a family unrelated to them named McLaughlin, who also lived there with 7 people in their family. There was also another family, I forget their name, there was only a couple, that was 19, but then the Dugans, because they needed the money, also rented out probably space within a room. They didn't have a room, but they rented it out to a man named Patrick Rafferty. So they were 20 people living in a small house that I was trying to figure out. I was trying to estimate that this morning, maybe 1,600 square feet. But that was typical. It wasn't until the 1920s that Providence caught up with the building. There were always so many people coming in, they couldn't build houses fast enough. Anyway. I will go back to just a couple other things. I don't know how well you can see that, but if you look at the corner of Spruce and Taft, our house is in the northeast section, and behind our house is a very large outhouse. They shared the outhouse with at least 3 other houses. So, and I also found out because they were notorious for not cleaning them. So after the cholera outbreak in 1854, they hired a fellow named Edwin Snow to be in charge of health in the city. And he started to impose a requirement that every 3 years, the outhouses should be emptied. It was also as far as money went, it was a prestigious job for Irishmen to take care of night soil. That's what it was called. And so they would advertise that they would come and take care of the night soil for you. There also wasn't running water in the flat, so people had to, all day long, women were always carrying water, going to the well and bringing it back for cooking, for washing, for all kinds of stuff. It was pretty horrendous. Now, if you recognize some of those names, they're not all exclusive to South Tyrone and North Monaghan. A lot of them are, and they're all names that you would have found in Providence in, say, 1860. And most of them you would have found on Federal Hill. And there's more than that. I just haven't added them to it because it would be crazy. I have on my website, if you're ever interested, I have a spreadsheet for Irish surnames and the counties they came from. And I've been collecting this, I've been putting this together for probably 12 or 15 years. I must have 15 to 1,800 different combinations of names with the counties. And what I'm looking for is I'm always looking for people that were born by the time of the famine, because later on people moved around more. I want to get a sense of where these families came from, not where they came from after they left to go to another place. And it has to be documented. It can be in a naturalization record. It can be in, well, it can be in the old stone bank records. I've found over 4,000 Irish people that put down where they came from in Ireland, where they were born. Mike said I'd found 4,000 records. We have 30,000 records now. And that's a whole other topic that you can ask me questions about afterwards. Anyway, and there's little kids walking right close to where my family lived. And you can see that they're barefoot like almost everybody else in those photos. So they come to Providence, they need jobs. What do? Three big employers, two really big employers, the calendaring company in the upper left-hand side. They recruited a man named John McKenna, there I go again, in 1827 to come over. He knew how to work the machines they were using. He came from County Armagh, right next to County Monaghan. He knew the machines, how they worked. He knew everything about the business inside and out. He was also an inventor, as was his son later on. Father Bob and I were talking about it and kind of thinking that he may have been running at least the machinery and in charge of the 200 workers that were there. A lot of the workers were also, they came from all over Ireland, but a lot of them came from this little patch of land. You can see it in their names, like McKenna. He was also the first Irish family to move on to Federal Hill, and his son James, who was born in 1828, was the first Irish kid born on Federal Hill. Later on, there'd be thousands of us. And the lower corner, on the lower left-hand corner, is Allen's print works. Philip Allen was a hero to the Irish population. He was a wealthy man. He came from old Yankee stock. He employed between 200 and 250 men, Irishmen, at his place. He also, just like at the calendaring company, he put a guy named Murphy, James Murphy, in charge of the workers. So you had an Irishman running the day-to-day operations. And when they built the cathedral, he supplied a Spanish bell. And when they built St. Patrick's Church, he supplied another Spanish bell. And if anybody knows where those bells are, please tell Father Bob, because he's been looking for those bells for a long time and he doesn't know what happened to them. So, and then there's the New England Butt Company, which made, I'll show you, that's right on the right-hand side. It's there today. It's a beautiful building. The painting of people working inside New England Butt, that's a Rhode Island Historical Society owns the painting. It was painted in 1886 inside the New England Butt Company. That's where my great-great-grandfather worked. He died just before this, but he would have recognized some of the people in that picture. You can see, like, one guy doesn't have a chin, he's got that Irish, that kind of Ulster no chin deal going on. I have a chin, it's covered up. You can't see it, no chin. Anyway, and here's some of the things that he built, that he made. It was a really horrendous job, like a lot of jobs were. So he worked with fire every day. Sometimes people get splattered with hot iron, and it would disfigure them at the very least. They worked, as most of them did, they worked 14-hour days. So from where he lived in Federal Hill, I estimated it would take him about 25 minutes to walk down one way and then come back the other way. And of course, in the wintertime, and you couldn't be late, because if you were late, they were going to cut your pay by a quarter. In the wintertime, there'd be ice on the streets and it'd be very dangerous. And still, he and his lads would get up in the morning, they'd come out of the house, they'd smoke their cigarettes, and they'd walk down on their way to Pearl Street, and they would be talking among each other, just talking quietly. But I bet anybody living along the way where they talked would wake up and say, "Oh, those guys again." That's what they did. And meanwhile, they had to cross over another group of guys that were walking down to the calendaring company, and they were doing the same thing. They had their lunch pail, probably smoking a cigarette, talking about things. That was only a 10-minute walk for them. And then there'd be 14 hours working. Okay, so there were also people who were entrepreneurs, started their own businesses. Thomas Monaghan had a shop on Harris Avenue. He lived up on Acorn Street on the hill. And later on, his family, I had contact with his family. His family were making trucks in the 1920s. They converted over from doing blacksmithing to building wagons and trucks. And then I think as late as the 1960s, they were building police cars, or the outsides, or building I don't know. But his business continued. Mike McKenna was a stucco worker. He had his own business, but he lived up on the hill. He worked down in the city. And Francis Hackett, another man who had all kinds of housing, all kinds of things for the houses. So here's where it really hurts. When people showed up, very often kids arrived with sick parents who didn't survive. They got ship fever. Maybe they lived for a week after they came to America, or like my ancestor, Peter McKenna, died at 42 years old with little babies on hand. And so as early as 1846, the Irish community knew they needed to take care of orphans. There were orphans all over the place, not just Irish kids, but orphans of all sorts. I remember reading about two little girls, Driscoll girls, ages 5 and 3. They lived in the woods up on Federal Hill, and would come out during the day to beg. And someone found them, and they took them first to Dexter Asylum, and then they took them, luckily they took them to the Children's Friends Society. The Children's Friends Society, which still exists today in Providence and still takes care of kids like that. Wonderful, wonderful group of people. And they were brought there and they were taken care of. But a lot of them weren't taken care of. Or what they would do is they would find jobs for them. So very often they ended up working in factories. And so the factories were taking in little kids like they were 8 and 10, 12 years old. All of these kids, the pictures on the right-hand side and the picture at the top are taken on Federal Hill. The far left, Federal Hill. The boy in the middle is Anthony, Rhode Island. And the guys down at the bottom is also Federal Hill. I try to keep only, and these were done by Hine back in about 1910. I'm not very good at finding 19th century photographs, sadly. And here are some of the kids. And they were, the Irish community that came, there were good guys, there were bad guys, there were people that suffered a lot. There were people that suffered mental illnesses, mercury poisoning, other kinds of poisoning from working in factories. It was a rough and tumble group, and a rough and tumble life to get through. And a lot of them ended up here at the Reform School. And during the Civil War, I found this in the old Stone Bank records. One of the units, one of the Rhode Island military units, went to the reform school and paid kids to, you could get out. One kid who was 18, he'd been in there since he was 8 years old, and he went into the military in order to get out of the reform school. Russians are doing the same thing today. And they were put in for all kinds of things. There was a kid who was 8 years old. He stole a few apples. He got 3 years in prison. Now, I don't think they intended to give him 3 years, but they put him in, and then maybe he got into fights with kids and stuff, or whatever happened, he never got released for 3 years. And if you go to my blog, Federal Hill Irish, I've got a lot of stories like that in there. The stories like I won't be able to tell today. When I was here last time, I told a story about Katie Conley, and I'll make it very brief because I know that some of you remember this story. It's a sad story. Little Katie Conley was 10 or 11 years old, and it was a really wet, rainy night in Providence. It was a northeaster, and Walter Danforth, who a couple of years later would become mayor of the city, well-to-do man, he's sitting and having a cigar or reading a book, and he hears a knock, knock, knock on the door. And he opens up the door, and here's this little girl. As he said, she had no bonnet, she had no coat on, she's just there, and she's crying. She was looking for her cousin, because her cousin, a McElroy from Tyrone, was the domestic live-in servant at the house. And she didn't know where to turn. So Walter Danforth brought her in, and Mrs. Danforth ran a bath for her, and they tried to get her comfortable. And she said, my parents are beating me, and I just can't stay at home anymore. And so Walter Danforth, and you can see these are parts of the letter that he wrote. He wrote a letter to the city to see if they could do something with Katie, maybe get her into the Children's Friends Society. Well, they actually got her in. And then I went to the Friends Society, and they kindly let me go through their records. They have handwritten records, just like the city has. And Katie Conley, who had this wonderful story, the woman in charge at the Child's Friends Society said, "This is a nasty girl. We don't believe a word she says." So where does that lie? So, and also said, she has a habit of going walking, running away. So poor Katie. There was a Katie Conley who I found about 5, 6, 8 years later, who was a prostitute in the city. I hope that wasn't her, but the poor girl, it was very typical of what these kids went through. And people worked really hard to make it better for them. Now, the problem is prostitution. A lot of women went into prostitution. In I think it's 1849, a woman named Catherine Hamilton, a good Ulster name, had a house of ill repute up on Knight Street, Federal Hill. So Federal Hill had a lot of things going on for it, including bad, illegal things. So they sent the night watchman out, or they sent the police out, and I've also got their stories too. They come in and they say, "Well, I don't know what's going on there. I knew nothing about it, but there were these carriages." And all these, they say, these men in carriages come and go, but we don't know what's going on inside. It's like they don't want to be tarred with the story, but they're reporting to their chief on what's going on. Now, I looked in all the newspapers. I looked in the Providence Journal. I couldn't find a word about this. I've looked everywhere. What I think happened was she was taking care of some very powerful men in the city, and they wanted it covered up. So what they did is they issued a warning out to her, and they demanded that she come. She didn't show up. They demanded again she come. She didn't show up, but she disappeared. She disappeared from Providence. She disappeared from history. How am I doing on time? Because I don't want to drive you guys crazy. Oh, this is long. I'm going to finish up very quickly. So this man, James Donnelly, comes to Providence. I like this photograph of him particularly because he looks so arrogant in it. And he was kind of arrogant, but he was a good man. he was collecting money for the new Irish Catholic University in Dublin. They could finally have their own university. And so he came to Providence and spent a couple of months in Providence. He came to Providence because he was from County Monaghan, but he did a lot of his work across the border in Tyrone. And he writes about the different people like McKay, the peddler, and these other people that he sees. One guy who used to work for his dad, he meets in Providence. And he says, those girls from True, that's Northern Monaghan, those girls from True, little girls, are so generous with their money. He liked everybody based on the money he got. Anyway, and he also, Father Bob and I talked about this, he had a passion for food and drink. He is often getting drunk and reporting on it. He's often eating oysters and reporting on it. But the reason he's here is he was very impressed with the beauty of the city and the wealth of the city, but he was very upset with Irish bad habits. He found them too superstitious. When he didn't like it when he saw that Irish men were fighting with each other. Bad image you're giving to the Irish people. He didn't like it when there were funeral processions. And the funeral procession from Federal Hill, for example, would go down into the valley and they would go up to Smith Hill and they'd bury. And so that was a long walk, slow walk with women keening. And he said, women keening is a terrible, terrible thing. You got to keep your emotions inside. So he was a tough guy. And so, he also didn't like people believing in things like banshees and stuff like that. So he was getting upset at that kind of thing. But by the time he left, he was upset with pretty much everybody. He was upset with the other Catholic priests there. He was upset with the city. But apparently he got some money because I've got records of people giving money, including my family. Civil War comes. I'm going to make this very short. This fellow was from County Tyrone. He died in battle, never made it back. His name and his brother's name are on the Sailor and Soldier memorial right in front of City Hall. You can find the story on my website. Another one was John McKenna, another McKenna that shows up. And he died at Andersonville. And it's a really gruesome thing that happened to him. But I don't want to take up your time with this. So eventually the war comes to an end. People start to rebuild. They start to have success. In the middle, Patrick McAvey is the guy who gets the contract to build St. Mary's up on Federal Hill. Michael Goldrick at the bottom is the man who gets the contract from McAvey to do the roofing for him. And you can see his son, Mark Goldrick, opened a store on Federal Hill. That building is still there. I've taken pictures of it. I've talked to the owner of the place. It looks exactly the same. So a lot of new businesses were building up. And because we had fought in a war and we'd proved ourselves, they finally said that Irish people were worthy of being policemen. They wouldn't let them be policemen before the war. This fellow became the chief of police eventually. And we have very famous people like Gilbane, the builder, a couple of boys from County Leitrim, not exactly in my neck of the woods, and also McCarthy, who became the first and only immigrant mayor of the city. And then, of course, George M. Cohan grew up on or near Wickeden Street. So there were people that were making progress, and this is a very, very tough story, which I will not share with you right now because I'm running late. But most people continue to struggle, and they continue to struggle very, very hard. A small group made it to the top, and others kept working their way up, as we know. And then the Italians started coming in. As my great aunt said, the worst part was not only did they move into our neighborhood, but they had money. They had big cars. She told me that years ago. But still into the 1960s, Irish people were still living on the hill. And here's an Irish family. This Irish fellow named Mike Halloran, and he's making horseshoes with his sidekick, his employee, and that's in 1915. So it remained an Irish. It was called the Little Italy, but it remained a very strong little Ulster for a long time. Here is a shot of the city in 1920. And then very quickly, what is left over, if you go up to Federal Hill and you look for the Irish up there, there is Traynor Street, which is actually a sort of a back street behind some of the restaurants up there. It's an alleyway now. There's also McVoy Street, which is about 2 blocks long. It used to be quite a long street. Thomas McAvoy had his house right on the corner of that and owned most of the property. But there's very little else to show when you go up onto the hill. And those are, I love pilings. Those are the pilings down near Wickeden Street, or where India Point, where a lot of ships came in and where people came in. So there's also this, and I'd be very happy someday to take people on a tour of St. Patrick's Cemetery. I invite my wife all the time. I invited her to come today to St. Patrick's. I cannot talk her into it. The stories, just like the cemeteries here, the stories are in the stones, where they were born, how they lived, how they died, what their aspirations were. And then in 2011, my family, my dad, and my son and I went back to Monaghan, to the farm. That's Francie McKenna, and he and my dad were about the same age, late 80s. So we reconnected. And I want to thank you very much and encourage you to take a look at Federal Hill Irish. Thank you. So what I'd like to do is open this up for questions if you have any. Yes.
I will walk around with us. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yes. That's a good question. They were in the records, it would say $1.25 to send Murphy and his 3 kids to Boston. Or in some cases, yes. Well, there's a very good question, because in Boston, it was typical in Boston to send people back to Ireland. But I found records, not a lot of records. They sent some people back to Ireland. They paid for them to get them out. So they probably were people they shipped off to Boston or shipped off to New Haven or to New York who came back again. And they were sent to Ireland. Where would they go when they got back? Their houses had been torn down. They didn't have families were gone. One group of people were sent back to Liverpool. Liverpool was a way station. What do they do when they get there? It was horrible. So that's what they did.
Ray, due to the fact that we have a Zoom crowd, I have to walk around with the microphone and present it to the people that have questions.
Good.
So that the Zoom crowd can hear a
Okay.
question and your response.
Other questions? Well, I will say that there is this thing called the Old Stone Bank Project. The records are owned by Rhode Island Historical Society. Less than 2 years ago, I started a group of transcribers, and we have transcribed 30,000 records, and they tell all kinds of stories. Some of them don't tell anything. Some of them just have an address, but a lot of them will tell you, well, Mr. May sitting back there, 2 or 3 days ago, I got a note from Ann Arnold, and I took a quick look and I found his great-grandfather, and his great-grandfather lost a leg at Chancellorsville, and they sent him off to Maine to old soldiers home. I found this record just like that. Now there are another 200 to 300,000 records to still be transcribed. So I'm looking for volunteers, but in the meantime, I found 2 of my great-great-grandparents. I didn't know where they were from, and I found where they were born. It's an incredible project. So look into that. That's on my website as well, Federal Hill Irish, and read my stories. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ray, we can't thank you enough. You're your research is really exquisite. And I had a takeaway tonight that I didn't realize, and I should have. And that is that the same punishments that they were escaping in Ireland for stealing food, et cetera, they encountered upon arrival here. So it was not a happy time. And I've looked at it with a great sense of melancholy, because I know that you have briefed over in County Monaghan as well, and maybe Tyrone, I don't know. But
In Roscommon. As well.
in Roscommon, where my family is from, Boyle, Roscommon. But we had a great experience in July, and I say melancholy because of the fact that so many people came here and never looked back, never went back, never looked back. And experience of driving through Tyrone today, which we did in July, north to south, one of the prettiest places you could ever see, that beautiful pastoral setting over there.
Yeah.
So sad to think that these people never had the opportunity or desire to return to the homeland. But I'm going to present you with our badge of honor here.
Thank you so much.
That is the logo for the museum, and it's also on the Gaelic cross at the Barney Street Cemetery. So what we need to do is arrange to get you up to the Barney Street Cemetery and have a tour by Steve Marino. We'll make that happen sometime.
I've heard he's a very good tour guide.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good. But thanks so much.
I thank you.